Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was Queen of the United Kingdom and the Dominions of the British Commonwealth from the 11th of December, 1936 to the 6th of February, 1952 as the wife of King George VI. She was concurrently the last Empress of India until the British Raj was dissolved in August 1947. After her husband died, she was officially known as Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, to avoid confusion with her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was the youngest daughter and the ninth of 10 children of Claude Bowes-Lyon, Lord Glamis, later the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorne in the Peerage of Scotland, and his wife, Cecilia Cavendish-Bentinck. Her mother was descended from British Prime Minister William Cavendish-Bentinck, 3rd Duke of Portland, and Governor-General of India Richard Wellesley, 1st Marquis Wellesley, who was the elder brother of another Prime Minister, Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington. The location of Elizabeth's birth remains uncertain, but reputedly she was born either in her parents' Westminster home at Belgrave Mansions, Grosvenor Gardens. Her birth was registered at Hitchin, Hertfordshire, near the Strathmore's English country house, St Paul's Waldenbury, which was also given as her birthplace in the 1901 and 1911 censuses. She was christened there on the 23rd of September, 1900, in the local parish church, All Saints. Elizabeth spent much of her childhood at St Paul's Walden and at Glamis Castle, the Earl's ancestral home in Scotland. She was educated at home by a governess until the age of 8, and was fond of field sports, ponies, and dogs. When she started school in London, she astonished her teachers by precociously beginning an essay with 2 Greek words from Xenophon's Anabasis. Her best subjects were literature and scripture. After returning to private education under a German Jewish governess, Kate Kubler, she passed the Oxford local examination with distinction at age 13. On Elizabeth's 14th birthday, Britain declared war on Germany. 4 of her brothers served in the army. Her elder brother, Fergus, an officer in the Black Watch Regiment, was killed in action at the Battle of Loos in 1915. Another brother, Michael, was reported missing in action on the 28th of April, 1917. 3 weeks later, the family discovered he had been captured after being wounded. He remained in a prisoner of war camp for the rest of the war. Glamis was turned into a convalescent home for wounded soldiers, which Elizabeth helped to run. She was particularly instrumental in organizing the rescue of the castle's contents during a serious fire on the 16th of September, 1916. Prince Albert, Duke of York, Bertie to the family, was the second son of King George V. He initially proposed to Elizabeth in 1921, but she turned him down, being afraid never again to be free to think, speak and act as I feel I really ought to. When he declared he would marry no other, his mother, Queen Mary, visited Glamis to see for herself the girl who had stolen her son's heart. She became convinced that Elizabeth was the one girl who could make Bertie happy, but nevertheless refused to interfere. At the same time, Elizabeth was courted by James Stuart, Albert's equerry, until he left the prince's service for a better-paid job in the American oil business. In February 1922, Elizabeth was a bridesmaid at the wedding of Albert's sister, Princess Mary, to Viscount Lascelles. The following month, Albert proposed again, but she refused him once more. Eventually in January 1923, Elizabeth agreed to marry Albert, despite her misgivings about royal life. Albert's freedom in choosing Elizabeth, not a member of a royal family, though the daughter of a peer, was considered a gesture in favor of political modernization. Previously, princes were expected to marry princesses from other royal families. They selected a platinum engagement ring featuring a cashmere sapphire with 2 diamonds adorning its sides. The couple married on the 26th of April, 1923, at Westminster Abbey. Unexpectedly, Elizabeth laid her bouquet at the tomb of the unknown warrior on her way into the abbey, in memory of her brother Fergus. Elizabeth became styled Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. Following a wedding breakfast at Buckingham Palace prepared by chef Gabriel Scoomy, Elizabeth and Albert honeymooned at Polesden Lacey, a manor house in Surrey owned by the wealthy socialite and friend Margaret Greville. They then went to Scotland, where she caught unromantic whooping cough, Duchess of York. After a successful royal visit to Northern Ireland in July 1924, the Labour government agreed that Albert and Elizabeth could tour East Africa from December 1924 to April 1925. The Labour government was defeated by the Conservatives in a general election in November, which Elizabeth described as marvellous to her mother, and the Governor-General of Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, Sir Lee Stack, was assassinated 3 weeks later. Despite this, the tour went ahead, and they visited Aden, Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan, but Egypt was avoided because of political tensions. Albert had a stammer, which affected his ability to deliver speeches, and after October 1925, Elizabeth assisted in helping him through the therapy devised by Lionel Logue, an episode portrayed in the 2010 film The King's Speech. In 1926, the couple had their first child, Princess Elizabeth Lilibet, to the family, who would later become Queen Elizabeth II. Albert and Elizabeth, without their child, travelled to Australia to open Parliament House in Canberra in 1927. She was, in her own words, very miserable at leaving the baby. Their journey by sea took them via Jamaica, the Panama Canal and the Pacific. Elizabeth fretted constantly over her baby back in Britain, but their journey was a public relations success. She charmed the public in Fiji when, as she was shaking hands with a long line of official guests, a stray dog walked in on the ceremony. She shook its paw as well. In New Zealand she fell ill with a cold and missed some engagements, but enjoyed the local fishing in the Bay of Islands accompanied by Australian sports fisherman Harry Andreas. On the return journey, via Mauritius, the Suez Canal, Malta, and Gibraltar, their transport, HMS Renown, caught fire, and they prepared to abandon ship before the fire was brought under control. The couple's second daughter, Princess Margaret, was born at Glamis Castle in 1930. The couple initially lived at White Lodge, Richmond Park, before moving to 145 Piccadilly, Queen Consort. On the 20th of January, 1936, George V died and his eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales, became King Edward VIII. Just months into Edward's reign, his decision to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson caused a constitutional crisis that resulted in his abdication. Elizabeth's husband, Albert, reluctantly became king in his brother's place on the 11th of December, 1936 under the regnal name of George VI. Elizabeth and her husband were crowned King and Queen of the United Kingdom and the British Dominions, and Emperor and Empress of India, in Westminster Abbey on the 12th of May, 1937. The date previously scheduled for Edward VIII. Elizabeth's crown was made of platinum and was set with the Koh-i-Noor diamond. Edward married Wallis Simpson, and they became the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, but while Edward was a Royal Highness, George VI withheld the style from Wallis, a decision that Elizabeth supported. Overseas visits. In summer 1938, a state visit to France by the King and Queen was postponed for 3 weeks because of the death of Elizabeth's mother, Lady Strathmore. In 2 weeks, Norman Hartnell created an all-white trousseau for Elizabeth, who could not wear colours as she was still in mourning. The visit was designed to bolster Anglo-French solidarity in the face of aggression from Nazi Germany. The French press praised the demeanour and charm of the royal couple during the delayed but successful visit, augmented by Hartnell's wardrobe. Nevertheless, Nazi aggression continued, and the government prepared for war. After the Munich Agreement of 1938 appeared to forestall the advent of armed conflict, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was invited onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace with the King and Queen to receive acclamation from a crowd of well-wishers. While broadly popular among the general public, Chamberlain's policy towards Hitler was the subject of some opposition in the House of Commons, which led historian John Grigg to describe George VI's behaviour in associating himself so prominently with a politician as the most unconstitutional act by a British sovereign in the present century. However, historians argue that the King only ever followed ministerial advice and acted as he was constitutionally bound to do. In May and June 1939, Elizabeth and her husband toured Canada from coast to coast and back, the first time a reigning monarch had toured Canada. They also visited the United States, spending time with President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the White House and his Hudson Valley estate. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt said that Elizabeth was perfect as a queen, gracious, informed, saying the right thing and kind but a little self-consciously regal. The tour was designed to bolster transatlantic support in the event of war, and to affirm Canada's status as an independent kingdom sharing with Britain the same person as monarch. Second World War. During the Second World War, the royal couple became symbols of the fight against fascism. Shortly after the declaration of war, the Queen's Book of the Red Cross was conceived. 50 authors and artists contributed to the book, which was fronted by Cecil Beaton's portrait of Elizabeth and was sold in aid of the Red Cross. She also broadcast to the nation in an attempt to comfort families during the evacuation of children and the mobilization of fighting-age men. Elizabeth publicly refused to leave London or send the children to Canada, even during the Blitz, when the British cabinet advised her to do so. She declared, "The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king. And the king will never leave." Elizabeth visited troops, hospitals, factories, and parts of Britain that were targeted by the German Luftwaffe, in particular the East End near London's docks. Her visits initially provoked hostility. Rubbish was thrown at her and the crowds jeered, in part because she wore expensive clothes that served to alienate her from people suffering the deprivations of war. She explained that if the public came to see her they would wear their best clothes, so she should reciprocate in kind. Norman Hartnell dressed her in gentle colours and avoided black to represent the rainbow of hope. When Buckingham Palace itself took several hits during the height of the bombing, Elizabeth said, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." Though the King and Queen spent the working day at Buckingham Palace, partly for security and family reasons they stayed at night at Windsor Castle about 20 miles 32 kilometres west of central London with their daughters. The palace had lost much of its staff to the army, and most of the rooms were shut. The windows were shattered by bomb blasts, and had to be boarded up. During the phony war the Queen was given revolver training because of fears of imminent invasion. French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier characterized Elizabeth as an excessively ambitious young woman who would be ready to sacrifice every other country in the world so that she may remain queen. Adolf Hitler is said to have called her the most dangerous woman in Europe because he viewed her popularity as a threat to German interests. However, before the war both she and her husband, like most of Parliament and the British public, had supported appeasement and Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, believing after the experience of the First World War that war had to be avoided at all costs. After the resignation of Chamberlain, the King asked Winston Churchill to form a government. Although the King was initially suspicious of Churchill's character and motives, in due course both the King and Queen came to respect and admire him. Post-war years. In the 1945 British general election, Churchill's Conservative Party was soundly defeated by the Labour Party of Clement Attlee. Elizabeth's political views were rarely disclosed, but a letter she wrote in 1947 described Attlee's high hopes of a socialist heaven on earth as fading and presumably describes those who voted for him as poor people, so many half-educated and bemused. "I do love them." Woodrow Wyatt thought her much more pro-conservative than other members of the royal family, but she later told him, "I like the dear old Labour Party." She also told the Duchess of Grafton, "I love communists." During the 1947 royal tour of South Africa, Elizabeth's serene public behaviour was broken, exceptionally, when she rose from the royal car to strike an admirer with her umbrella because she had mistaken his enthusiasm for hostility. The 1948 royal tour of Australia and New Zealand was postponed because of George's declining health. In March 1949, he had a successful operation to improve the circulation in his right leg. In summer 1951, Elizabeth and her daughters fulfilled the King's public engagements in his place. In September, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. After a lung resection, he appeared to recover, but the delayed trip to Australia and New Zealand was altered so that Princess Elizabeth and her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, went in the King and Queen's place in January 1952. George VI died in his sleep on the 6th of February, 1952 while Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh were in Kenya on a Commonwealth tour, and with George's death his daughter immediately became Queen Elizabeth II, Queen Mother. Shortly after George VI's death, Elizabeth began to be styled as Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother because the normal style for the widow of a king, Queen Elizabeth, would have been too similar to the style of her elder daughter, Queen Elizabeth II. Popularly, she became the Queen Mother or the Queen Mum. She was devastated by her husband's death and retired to Scotland. However, after a meeting with Prime Minister Winston Churchill, she broke her retirement and resumed her public duties. Eventually she became just as busy as Queen Mother as she had been as Queen Consort. In July 1953, she undertook her first overseas visit since the funeral when she visited the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland with Princess Margaret. She laid the foundation stone of the University College of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, the current University of Zimbabwe. Upon her return to the region in 1957, Elizabeth was inaugurated as the college's president, and attended other events that were deliberately designed to be multiracial. During her daughter's extensive tour of the Commonwealth over 1953–54, Elizabeth acted as a Councillor of State and looked after her grandchildren, Charles and Anne. In February 1959, she visited Kenya and Uganda. Elizabeth oversaw the restoration of the remote castle of May, on the north coast of Scotland, which she used to get away from everything for 3 weeks in August and 10 days in October each year. She developed her interest in horse racing, particularly steeplechasing, which had been inspired by the amateur jockey Lord Mildmay in 1949. She owned the winners of approximately 500 races. Although, contrary to rumour, she never placed bets, she did have the racing commentaries piped direct to her London residence, Clarence House, so she could follow the races. As an art collector, she purchased works by Claude Monet, Augustus John and Peter Carl Feyberge, among others. In February 1964, Elizabeth had an emergency appendectomy, which led to the postponement of a planned tour of Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji until 1966. She recuperated during a Caribbean cruise aboard the royal yacht, Britannia. In December 1966, she underwent an operation to remove a tumor, after she was diagnosed with colon cancer. Contrary to rumors which subsequently spread, she did not have a colostomy. She was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1984 and a lump was removed from her breast. Her bouts with cancer were never made public during her lifetime. During her widowhood, Elizabeth continued to travel extensively, including on over 40 official visits overseas. In 1975, she visited Iran at the invitation of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The British ambassador and his wife, Anthony and Sheila Parsons, noted how the Iranians were bemused by her habit of speaking to everyone regardless of status or importance, and hoped the Shah's entourage would learn from the visit to pay more attention to ordinary people. Between 1976 and 1984, she made annual summer visits to France, which were among 22 private trips to continental Europe between 1963 and 1992. In 1982, Elizabeth was rushed to hospital when a fishbone became stuck in her throat, and had an operation to remove it. Being a keen angler, she calmly joked afterwards, "The salmon have got their own back." Similar incidents occurred at Balmoral in August 1986, when she was hospitalized at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary overnight but no operation was needed, and in May 1993, when she was admitted to the infirmary for surgery under general anesthetic. In 1987, Elizabeth was criticized when it emerged that two of her nieces, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, had been committed to a psychiatric hospital in Redhill, Surrey, in 1941 because they had severe learning disabilities. However, Burke's peerage had listed the sisters as dead, apparently because their mother, Fenella, Elizabeth's sister-in-law, was extremely vague when it came to filling in forms and might not have completed the paperwork for the family entry correctly. When Nerissa died in 1986, her grave was originally marked with a plastic tag and a serial number. Elizabeth said that the news of their institutionalization came as a surprise to her. In her later years, Elizabeth became known for her longevity. Her 90th birthday, the 4th of August, 1990, was celebrated by a parade on the 27th of June that involved many of the 300 organizations of which she was a patron. In 1995, she attended events commemorating the end of the war 50 years before, and had 2 operations, one to remove a cataract in her left eye, and one to replace her right hip. In 1998,
Her left hip was replaced after it was broken when she slipped and fell during a visit to Sandringham Stables. Elizabeth's 100th birthday was celebrated in a number of ways. A parade that celebrated the highlights of her life included contributions from Sir Norman Wisdom and Sir John Mills. Her image appeared on a special commemorative £20 note issued by the Royal Bank of Scotland, and she attended a lunch at the Guildhall, London, at which George Carey, the Archbishop of Canterbury, accidentally attempted to drink her glass of wine. Her quick admonition of "that's mine" caused widespread amusement. In November 2000, she broke her collarbone in a fall that kept her recuperating at home over Christmas and the New Year. On the 1st of August, 2001, Elizabeth had a blood transfusion for anemia after suffering from mild heat exhaustion, though she was well enough to make her traditional appearance outside Clarence House 3 days later to celebrate her 101st birthday. Her final public engagements included planting a cross at the Field of Remembrance on the 8th of November, 2001, a reception at the Guildhall, London, for the reformation of the 600 Squadron, Royal Auxiliary Air Force on the 15th of November, and attending the recommissioning of HMS Ark Royal on the 22nd of November. In December 2001, aged 101, Elizabeth fractured her pelvis in a fall. Even so, she insisted on standing for the national anthem during the memorial service for her husband on the 6th of February the following year. Just 3 days later, their second daughter Princess Margaret died. On the 13th of February 2002, Elizabeth fell and cut her arm in her sitting room at Sandringham House. An ambulance and doctor were called, and the wound was dressed. She was still determined to attend Margaret's funeral at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, 2 days later on the Friday of that week. Even though the Queen and the rest of the royal family were concerned about the journey the Queen Mother would face to get from Norfolk to Windsor, she was also rumoured to be hardly eating. Nevertheless, she flew to Windsor by helicopter, and so that no photographs of her in a wheelchair, which she hated being seen in, could be taken, she insisted that she be shielded from the press. She travelled to the service in a people carrier with blacked-out windows, which had been previously used by Margaret. On the 5th of March, 2002, Elizabeth was present at the luncheon of the annual lawn party of the Eton Beagles, and watched the Cheltenham races on television. However, her health began to deteriorate precipitously during her last weeks, after retreating to Royal Lodge for the final time. On the 30th of March, 2002, at 15:15 Greenwich Mean Time, Elizabeth died at the Royal Lodge, Windsor, at the age of 101. Her surviving daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, was by her side. The Queen Mother had been suffering from a chest cold since Christmas 2001. At 101 years and 238 days old, she was the first member of the British royal family to live past the age of 100. She was the longest living member of the British royal family at the time of her death. Her surviving sister-in-law, Princess Alice, Duchess of Gloucester, exceeded that, dying at the age of 102 on the 29th of October, 2004. She was one of the longest-lived members of any royal family.